Out of 91,000 soldiers, only 6,000 returned home. In 1956, the last captives finally saw Germany again. For the vast majority, Soviet captivity became nothing but a delayed grave. The men dropped their rifles after months of brutal siege. They expected to survive. Instead, the crude camp infrastructure killed them faster than bullets. 6,000 returning men meant less than 7% of the surrendered army actually made it out alive. The long columns marched straight into a freezing void. Temporary holding zones, like the infamous Beketovka transit camp, overflowed immediately. Guards shoved exhausted soldiers into unheated wooden barracks. Space ran out. The heavy stench of typhus fever and unwashed bodies filled the freezing rooms. Temperatures inside barely differed from the snowdrifts outside. Disease swept through the dark spaces. Typhus, dysentery, starvation. Men who had survived the relentless frontline meat grinder withered away in days. A soldier woke up next to a dead comrade. By evening, he became a corpse himself. Soviet logistics struggled to feed the Red Army, leaving the captive enemy with empty rations. The death toll soared into the tens of thousands before conditions changed. Moscow realized that endless piles of frozen corpses held no economic value. Soviet command officially reorganized the remaining captives into forced labor battalions to rebuild the ruined cities. Where did 85,000 people disappear in just weeks? They froze. This massive wave of death started right in front of the Soviet camera lenses. A tall, gaunt German commander emerged from a ruined basement into the blinding winter light. Newsreels broadcast the surrender of Friedrich Paulus, proving to the entire world that the enemy could finally be broken. Behind the captured generals stood the walking residue of a shattered army. 91,000 men stepped out of the burning rubble wearing nothing but filthy rags. The dull crunch of frozen snow echoed constantly under the feet of frost-bitten prisoners. The air temperature held at a brutal -25 degrees Celsius. Soviet operators captured the ultimate propaganda victory, but they deliberately stopped filming when the actual horror began. The captives were a fragile crowd of living ghosts pushed far beyond human endurance. Out of the 91,000 men who surrendered, approximately 85,000 died in the following weeks. Dysentery and severe malnutrition claimed thousands of lives before the guards could even herd them into the transit camps. Left entirely without medical care, endless columns of prisoners walk slowly into the depths of the snow-covered territory. Exhausted generals throw their personal weapons onto the frozen ground. The army they once commanded no longer exists. By the time the last units surrendered on February 2, 1943, the fighting force was completely destroyed. Paulus gave up the southern ruins first. The northern defenders held out briefly before collapsing. What crawled out of the shattered basements was not a military formation. They were walking corpses. Frostbite blackened their limbs. Malnutrition shut down their organs. Berlin abandoned them. 125,000 dead. This staggering death toll equals the entire population of a European city. These men perished inside the frozen trap long before the white flags appeared. 91,000 men stumbled forward into captivity. They crossed the point of no return weeks earlier. Surviving the actual battle meant nothing without food or shelter. Soviet guards processed the remnants of the command staff. The capitulation yielded 2,500 officers and 20 generals. What does a sudden promotion to Field Marshal mean for a commander leading an encircled army? It is an implicit order to commit suicide. Why did 20 generals watch their men slowly die instead of laying down their arms? The answer hides in a single encrypted radio message from the capital. This tragedy began during Operation Uranus on November 19, 1942. Soviet tank divisions severed the overstretched flanks, leaving 300,000 encircled soldiers inside a frozen cauldron. A promised relief force pushed through the snowdrifts, but stalled exactly 48 kilometers from the perimeter. That remaining gap equals less than an hour of driving on a standard modern highway. Yet those 48 kilometers condemned the isolated troops to starvation without any hope of rescue. Disaster accelerated rapidly when Soviet infantry overran the last 2 operational dirt airstrips inside the pocket. This loss completely severed the inadequate aerial bridge, halting all deliveries of food and heavy ammunition. On January 24th, Paulus transmitted a bleak assessment to the high command in the capital. He informed the dictator that 18,000 wounded lay in the ruined buildings without medical bandages or painkillers. The commander begged for permission to cease hostilities and save the rapidly collapsing remnants of his forces. Berlin stubbornly refused the plea, demanding that the abandoned battalions hold their shattered positions until the bitter end. The leadership traded the lives of starving men for a momentary illusion of unyielding national resilience. The ultimate betrayal arrived on January 30, 1943, exactly 10 years since the regime seized power. Down in the freezing basement of the ruined Univermag department store, the cold static crackle of the radio echoed off the damp walls. A hunched radio man transcribed the incoming transmission and passed the decoded slip to his exhausted commander. Paulus read the official text confirming his unexpected elevation to the highest rank in the armed forces. He saw the trap. The dictator explicitly expected him to use his personal weapon and end his own life. No Prussian field marshal had ever surrendered his troops to an enemy in the nation's military history. General Vasily Chuikov stood on the banks of the Volga River. He ordered his battalion straight into the rubble. Fight for every floor. Die for every room. This trap did not suddenly snap shut in January. The jaws locked together back in the autumn of 1942. Look at a single ruined apartment block. The air hung heavy with the suffocating smell of brick dust and cordite. Soldiers fought with sharpened spades in dark kitchens. They bled out on shattered balconies. Now multiply this nightmare by an entire city. The German 6th Army collided with Chuikov's 62nd Army in a relentless meat grinder. Commanders threw fresh regiments into the furnace. The street battles chewed up elite divisions long before the winter frost arrived. The encirclement in November 1942 merely sealed the fate of an already exhausted force. Back in the scorching summer heat, men had already butchered each other over a single concrete stairwell. The daily casualty rates defied human comprehension. Yet through the endless barrage, the Soviet infantry dug their boots into the dirt. They held a narrow strip of shattered earth right at the water's edge. Why did Soviet guards watch Germans die of typhus without a single trace of pity? 2 million comrades were dead. German soldiers expected no mercy on the Volga because their captors vividly remembered the invasion of June 22, 1941. Endless columns of Soviet prisoners marched westward into captivity during that catastrophic summer. The Wehrmacht captured 3 million Red Army POWs and corralled them into massive open dirt pits. Without shelters or rations, those captive men died slowly from starvation and freezing winds. By the winter of 1942, a dead silence hung over the sprawling mass graves. That single death toll easily exceeds the total military losses of multiple Allied nations combined. Deep inside Soviet headquarters, clerks mechanically stamped thin paper record cards. The faded ink on those fragile sheets tallied lost lives directly in the millions. In the ruined landscape of Stalingrad, the roles abruptly reversed. The guards overseeing the ragged survivors knew exactly what happened in those earlier camps. They offered nothing. Before the battle, Soviet authorities held roughly 120,000 Germans. Then the trap closed. The number of captured Germans suddenly spiked to 170,000. How many men stayed forever in the Siberian permafrost? The answer remains hidden in closed folders. Millions burned in Soviet camps. The exact toll stays locked. Moscow guards its vaults. Even in 2017, 70 years passed. State memory vanished. Bureaucrats protected paper. Reality was flesh. Official silence masked a slaughter. The death rate shattered records. Consider the Italian 8th Army. They surrendered at the Don River. Temperatures hit -30. No warm coats. The icy wind cut deep. A prisoner stumbled forward. He hit the snow. Exhaustion crushed him. He never rose. Burial details worked daily. Spades struck the ground. The frozen Siberian earth crunched. Bodies vanished into shallow pits. Between 56 and 79% died, the highest wartime toll. They arrived starving. They froze fast. Cold took everyone. Ideology meant nothing. The physical process of a German soldier slowly freezing in a Siberian camp matched exactly the agonizing death of a Soviet prisoner trapped in German captivity. Behind those sealed archives lay a relentless reality. 14-hour shifts at logging sites and frozen construction zones. 1,094,250 lives. A single nameless captive hauled wet concrete onto a freezing scaffolding. His hands bled. His boots turned to ice. He carried heavy buckets until his spine gave out. Work became a slow execution. 10 to 14 hours a day, every single day. German prisoners dragged heavy timber through the mud. They laid thousands of kilometers of railway steel. Across the vast Soviet landscape, massive factories pierced the sky. Grand infrastructure rose from the ashes of war. Yet the state completely erased the builders. No monuments, no plaques. The victors rebuilt a shattered nation purely on broken foreign bones. The West German Maschke Commission spent decades chasing ghosts. Investigators interviewed returning survivors across a divided Europe. They gathered horrific memories piece by piece. They uncovered the true scale of this invisible workforce. Soviet official records admitted to a tiny fraction of the tragedy. Moscow counted 381,000 dead. The actual toll, buried beneath the concrete, was 1,094,250. How to feed millions of prisoners in an exhausted country? The leadership found a simple answer. Feed only those who hold a pickaxe. Men surviving 14 hours in the mines returned to barren barracks. Their daily ration ignored basic human needs. Food was fuel, nothing more. From 1941 to 1947, survival meant working. Behind the Ural Mountains, evacuated factories demanded constant labor. The feeding line moved without pity. A rusted ladle struck metal. Watery soup splashed into tin bowls. The sour smell of rotten cabbage filled the freezing air. Next came a thin slice of dense black bread. That was the entire meal. But logic dictated a darker math. Calories matched physical output. A sick man produced nothing. His value vanished. An orderly walked past the wooden bunks. He stopped by a bedridden patient. No work. No bread. He turned away. The caloric intake for the incapacitated plummeted. It dropped to the lethal levels of besieged Leningrad, barely 600 calories. To save precious grain, camp commanders officially slashed the daily rations for the sick and wounded. Trains carrying heavy factory machines rolled east. They left behind the scorched fields of Ukraine. Cutting hospital food did not happen in a vacuum. The roots went back to the catastrophic loss of the southern lands. 1942 brought an existential threat. German forces occupied the vast agricultural regions, tearing the primary breadbaskets away from a desperate nation. Behind the advancing front line stretched a wasteland. Endless ruins of burned Ukrainian villages smoked under the open sky. There was no grain left. By 1943, pure despair dictated the rules inside the barbed wire. The camp guards starved alongside their prisoners. National hunger bred total ruthlessness. Compassion died first. Survival erased everything else. Enemy captives crashed to the very bottom of the food chain. No one fed foreign soldiers while their own people ate bark. Every spare ounce of grain fueled the war effort. The entire country bled out. Severe food shortages crippled both the civilian population and the millions of inmates locked inside the Soviet labor camps. Did international law protect the captives amidst the starvation of 1942? No. Moscow ignored the 1929 Geneva Convention. Legal obligations vanished. Guards herded the foreigners into an older labor complex. The secret police built these camps in the late 1920s. Camp commanders simply expanded their quotas. Wooden barracks swallowed new victims. German soldiers shared frozen bunks with Soviet political prisoners. One meat grinder, two different flags. The domestic repression apparatus seamlessly absorbed the outsiders. Officials had spent over a decade perfecting this exact routine. Maximum physical labor, minimum food rations. Men became cheap firewood. They died in the snow. Meanwhile, high-ranking Soviet diplomats stood at international podiums and publicly guaranteed the humane treatment of all captured enemies. Today, the Trans-Siberian Railway hauls tourists and commercial cargo. 80 years ago, it dragged hundreds of thousands of freezing men eastward. Endless columns of captives poured into the labor camps. The Geneva Convention meant nothing here. State security seized full control over the human flood. It started with 170,000 starving survivors after Stalingrad. Then the scale exploded. The catastrophic defeat of Operation Bagration in 1944 crushed an entire German army group. The numbers surged. The NKVD took charge of the logistics. Punitive organs suddenly inherited an ocean of exhausted flesh. Distributing this mass required a monstrous logistical chain. Transit points formed a continuous, unbreakable line. Sorting stations and holding pens stretched from the shattered western frontiers straight into the frozen heart of eastern Siberia. 3 million captives entered this meat grinder. That equaled the entire population of a European nation like Ireland at the time. A whole country of broken soldiers. Soviet clerks stamped the official tally at 2,800,000. But unrecorded dead men rotted in the rail cars. The true count hit 3 million. What did the recruitment of captured officers actually achieve? It triggered total panic within the high command and a brutal strike against the families of the generals. The men in the freezing camps were expected to simply die silently for their leader. Instead, these broken prisoners suddenly became the primary source of anxiety for Berlin. The ultimate psychological breaking point arrived when captured commanders spoke directly from Soviet frontline loudspeakers. Hitler read the intelligence reports detailing the treason at his secure headquarters. The dictator flew into a blind fury over the betrayal and immediately demanded merciless retaliation. He signed the decree. The swift order stripped the defectors' families of all state financial support without any warning. In the shattered economy of 1944 Germany, this loss meant instant poverty and actual starvation. Even the privileged wives of the highest-ranking generals abruptly lost their homes and their safety. The Nazi leadership realized their deepest fear of elite betrayal was now a terrifying reality. The harsh metallic crackle of the Soviet loudspeakers echoed daily over the miserable German trenches. Down in the mud, common soldiers listened to their revered commanders urge them to surrender. This psychological poison deeply infected troops who were completely exhausted by 3 years of war on the Eastern Front. Paranoia gripped the officers. They desperately calculated who might break their oath next under the relentless Soviet pressure. But the direct military effect of the recruited officers remained strictly limited while the fierce battles continued. The captured field marshal adjusted the microphone. He prepared to address his former subordinates. Friedrich Paulus was about to break his oath. The ultimate catalyst for blinding paranoia within the Nazi high command came directly through these Soviet airwaves. In 1944, his voice echoed over the Free Germany radio station. No one expected this. Paulus was the first field marshal in German military history to be taken alive. Stalingrad broke his army. Now, captivity broke his loyalty. Paulus publicly urged his former brothers-in-arms to turn their weapons against Berlin. He declared that fighting on would only burn their nation to ashes. This broadcast hit Berlin at the worst possible moment. 1944 was the year of the Valkyrie plot. A briefcase bomb had just ripped through Hitler's briefing room. The dictator was already hunting traitors among his own elite. Hearing Paulus call for mutiny fueled this raging frenzy. But the psychological warfare extended far beyond radio towers. Agents embedded with Soviet assault units. They dragged heavy loudspeakers into the mud. They blasted appeals across the scarred earth. Then came the shadow work. Saboteurs slipped into their old Wehrmacht uniforms. They crossed the trenches in the dead of night to sow pure chaos. The shadow work required precision. Agents buttoned up authentic tunics. They loaded captured rifles. They crawled past barbed wire into German-held territory. Deep in the cold dugouts, freezing soldiers found the dropped leaflets. The wet propaganda papers rustled softly in the biting wind. Words promised life in exchange for surrender. Phantoms in field gray coats stepped into the dark. They crossed the front line. Who orchestrated these frontline broadcasts? German exiles and captured officers gathered in a camp near Moscow. Paulus, speaking to the troops, was just the visible peak. A year earlier, on July 12, 1943, Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach took the helm of a special officers' union. The secret police set up a political laboratory in Krasnogorsk. Guards brought selected captives here. Handlers forced sworn enemies into one room. Exiled communist writer Erich Weinert took the president's chair. Seydlitz-Kurzbach joined him. He carried the blood of an ancient Prussian dynasty. His family had given Germany generations of commanders. His defection hit Berlin hard. 38 founders formed the committee. 28 of them were Wehrmacht prisoners. 10 were communists. They had fled Hitler a decade earlier. Now they drafted manifestos alongside defeated aristocrats. Pure calculation. The propaganda engine roared to life. Agitators hauled heavy loudspeakers into the forward trenches. Amplified voices echoed across the scarred earth. They ordered German troops to drop their rifles. They demanded mutiny. Newspapers went to the front. The Krasnogorsk Committee required living voices. Prisoners arriving from the Stalingrad ruins suddenly began receiving rations and medical care. The Soviet calculation was ice cold. A living enemy turned out to be far more effective than a dead one. To forge this new psychological weapon, the NKVD leadership had to forcefully slash camp mortality rates. The first half of 1943 brought a harsh reality. Epidemics swept through the wooden barracks. Tuberculosis hollowed out the captive officers. Typhus decimated the exhausted ranks. Then Moscow changed the orders. Medical brigades arrived. The sharp stench of carbolic acid filled the damp rooms as Soviet doctors furiously fought the outbreaks. They showed no humanism. They merely protected state property. The death rate finally dropped. Camp commanders received strict new directives. Propaganda requires a functioning brain. Hard labor demands a beating heart. The guards fed the captives just enough calories to keep them standing on their feet during the brutal daily shifts. The survivors became a highly prized resource. But the initial victims simply vanished from history. The Soviet government destroyed the casualty rosters of every soldier who perished before the spring of 1943. What price did these men pay before becoming a propaganda weapon? Penal labor in deep mines and freezing barracks. Before anyone needed them alive for the cameras in 1943, the survivors marched straight into an icy hell. Look at a dead soldier on the frozen ground of Ukraine in 1942. Starvation, disease, total exhaustion. The uniforms differed, but a German corpse looked exactly like a Soviet one. The crunch of hardened earth under thin boots echoed through the crushing cold. Then the geography expanded. From the Urals to the Far East, freight trains dumped starving men into the Komi Republic and the dense Siberian taiga. The state established the GUPVI administration, a massive penal empire mirroring the civilian camps. Prisoners descended into the Donbass coal mines. The iron pickaxe froze solid into the rock. Black coal dust caked on their hollow, dead-eyed faces. Their cracked hands stacked heavy bricks. Shifts stretched to 14 hours. They laid foundations. They raised walls. The captive soldiers constructed new homes in the exact same cities they had bombed into rubble just months earlier. Guards separated officers from enlisted men. The Soviet leadership formally observed this specific Geneva Convention rule. Commanders did not swing pickaxes. They stayed inside. But the official exemption from hard labor meant nothing in this reality. Without extra food, the isolated commanders starved to death right alongside the frontline infantry. This relentless physical destruction laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Unbearable daily agony shattered their loyalty long before the political interrogators arrived. Winter winds tore through the thin wooden walls. The temperature plunged to -30.